surely everyone knows there's a group of people who, for whatever reason, whether of conscience, whether of just their iron will, they just decided that it's not for them to take these new treatments, right? These new vaccines. Don't they deserve and aren't they entitled to public health advice? Should they not know, for example, everything we've just looked at there with the vitamin D? Or what about the idea that, obesity is a risk factor? We know that SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, likes to infect human adipose tissue. In the work I've done, I've looked into, and I've seen there's a study, I think it was Kaiser Permanente from California, large study. They looked at 50,000 people, and they tried to find just statistical association, people who don't fare well with COVID. I think the endpoint was mortality. What was the highest risk factor where most of the people seem to have? And it was actually obesity.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Chatter. Before we get started, I just have a few quick messages. First off, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It's the best way that you can help us grow. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. It's going to help us rank higher and get more and more views and therefore bigger and better guests. Links for everything will be in the description below. So please enjoy the podcast. Before we start this podcast, I just want to give a short disclaimer. The opinions expressed within may not represent the majority of scientists on COVID-19 or the medical consensus on several issues. What we are trying to do is look at government sources to best understand the situation we are in. That's the only way we're going to move forwards, is by understanding where we're at. And in that, we explored some areas that might be considered controversial. However, we have done our best to try to explore them with intellectual honesty, and that is all I can really ask from myself and my guests. So, I hope you forgive us if we make any mistakes. Please enjoy the show. Right. Let's do this, man. Let's get banned from YouTube.
Sounds good. Sounds good to me.
I mean, that is a genuine fear that I have about this episode, but I feel it's got to the point where I can say these things on a podcast, and we can talk about it without people screaming at us for being, grandparent killers or COVID deniers or any of the associated things like that.
It sounds good.
So basically, the thing that I am here to talk to you about is the COVID death classification, the PCR tests, and the yellow card reporting data. All of these things have been kind of at the center of debates that have been going on, but then people haven't exactly acknowledged that there was a discussion happening about it. And the amount of times that I saw this through the pandemic and just tried to like really get a handle on like how realistic this data was and how, for example, how the deaths were being classified, whether this was, whether we were over-classifying it, whether we were under-classifying it. And the whole time I struggled to figure out what was the answer here. I mean, I didn't trust what the government and the media were, how they were interpreting the data. But at the same time, I was struggling to find people for whom I could say, yes, okay, they have explained it in a way that seems plausible, reasonable, isn't alleging some monstrous conspiracy that people can just like dismiss out of hand, and more talks about like the individual institutional level decisions that have led to these things being potentially inaccurately classified. So, Jonathan, I'm here with you today so you can clear all these problems up. So welcome to the show.
Sounds very good. It's great to be here, Josh.
No problem. So actually, why don't you just give us an idea of who you are and like what your background is and what your education is, and just so people can understand like where you're coming from on this.
Sure. Well, my name's Jonathan Weissman, and I'm a cybersecurity professional with background in software development, and also my undergraduate was in mathematics. So I've got quite an analytical approach towards things, and really my interest was piqued when I saw essentially the problem of the safety of the new vaccines as essentially being a problem of risk management. the population's being asked to make a decision on new technology. And I thought, from my professional background, I had something to offer there, because I felt that the debate and the discussion had been massively oversimplified, and not enough sort of serious data and information had been presented to people. So I wanted to really sort of get into that and explore it.
Okay, so then when did you start diving into the figures, and were you coming at this from like a purely statistical analysis level of things?
Not so much. I know quite a few people who are heavily involved in the statistics and the numbers. For me, I was really interested in the sort of biological aspect of, as I said, the vaccines, what's going on in the human body. I am also very interested to know what the government's rationale is for everything, because essentially everything they're doing is driven from data. We know governments love data and statistics, and so I am tracking many of the things they're saying in their political maneuvers. My interest mostly lies with the sort of biological side.
Okay. So, did you study like science in any form, or biology or virology?
Well, so, I studied biology, chemistry, physics as a school until A level, and then my speciality was mathematics. Got an undergraduate degree, and then my 2 master's degrees are in applied mathematics, which included some statistical modelling and applied use of mathematics, which I think gives you that sort of broad ability to be very logical, rational, to not be easily led by one study or one train of thought, and that's really what I tap into over the last 6 months or even 1 year. That's where I've started to acquire a sort of base level understanding of immunology, virology, enough to be able to interpret what's going on, I think, to an extent.
Okay, so but the main thing here is that like you're trying to run through we're trying to run through the data that's being presented to us and has been presented as justifications for a number of policies in the past. Thankfully, as of tomorrow, hopefully, it's all going to be gone, mostly. But then the issue still remains underlying it, is like, were all of these decisions based on faulty data? And that is the area that I'm keen to address in this podcast, because it's something that I have become very concerned that we're trying to make huge policy decisions that have like outrageously far-reaching impact upon like not just right now but future generations, upon children's development, upon just economic development. Like, it sounds so callous, be like, oh, you just care about the economy, bro. And it's like, no, the economy is people's fucking jobs and lives and livelihoods. So that is why I care. But anyway, the first thing we're going to go over here is the COVID death classification. So, yeah, would you like to explain to people how the COVID deaths have been, classified then for us, so we can start the discussion about this?
Sure. Well, as I'm sure many people know, it all comes down to this positive test result, the PCR, which we might get to speak about in a bit. I guess the first thing to say is if you think about what they say now, which is a death with COVID. So the government have actually softened and relaxed the language a little bit. They used to talk at the beginning in 2020 much more of died of COVID, these numbers, and now, and probably due to pressure from lots of sort of people asking the question, they've really softened that language. So that's a very important thing to note. And then the second thing with that is these deaths with COVID, so this is COVID on the death certificate, are not necessarily the same as COVID as the underlying factor, even if there's been a test result. So I know we've got some data we can have a look into it in a moment, and that actually really shows that even the government here in Northern Ireland are really only claiming 86.9% of the near 3,500 COVID-19 deaths as actually having COVID-19 as the underlying factor that then starts that chain of reaction leading to mortality. And then one other point I would also like to raise, and again, it touches on the PCR test, is really the idea that if you get hospitalized with anything, and remember, it could be totally unrelated to the progression of the COVID disease symptoms. So, for example, an accident in the home or in the workplace, you may have more than one test for COVID during the stay of your hospitalization, and it's, attaining that one test result, that's what's going to stick with you. And I do hear anecdotally of people who are exposed to multiple tests, and it certainly sounds like there's a desire for a positive test result to be logged against them, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense. So there's a few factors there I think are worth thinking about.
Okay. Well, I mean, don't come in here with your anecdotal evidence, man. Like that is just misinformation, obviously.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. We all live in a vacuum now.
Yes,
so.
exactly. Like anecdotes are no longer like in any way applicable. You can't say anything anecdotally because that's not backed up by the science. Yeah, I'm totally gonna get banned for this. But anyway, the classification of this. So we'll get to that 86% figure in just a minute that you mentioned, because I want to go over that. Yeah. But the issue for me basically is that, like, I've seen this 150 something thousand has been touted for the whole of the UK as the number of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. And I think the number's over 170,000 for people who are classified within 60 days of a positive test. Yep. I'm not sure why we have the two different figures, but that's, people like to tout the highest one because they want Boris Johnson to sound like he's done the worst possible job. Right. It's nothing. It doesn't seem to be anything to do with like trying to figure out what the real figure was. Because I've also seen the ONS have released that data that says there's 17,000 people have died with only COVID on their death certificate in the past 2 years. So it's like 9,000 last year and like 8,000 in 2021. Yep. Something around that. I don't think either figure are really like a good way of understanding how many people have died. Like, again, we're not talking like, we're just talking from this specific disease, because the effects from many other things that come around this are not really being sort of explored, and whether people would have died otherwise or not is almost impossible to figure out. So we stick to the numbers we can like talk about. But the number, people definitely died who wouldn't have, having contracted COVID, even if they had underlying conditions. Maybe that was like 5-10 years of life they would have had extra. The same thing could have happened if they'd got the flu or some other respiratory illness, but the reality is that like people died who wouldn't have, and that's basically what we're trying to figure out here. So to that, 86% you said of people have died, and that's So let's pull this up for us actually, and you can talk us through the data that we're looking at.
This is the data from NISR, I believe, the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency. Yeah. So it's sort of the local data here in Northern Ireland.
If this would work, that would be lovely. Keep talking. Well, I'll get it to work in a second.
Yeah,
there it is for us,
good.
But I'm trying to get up on the screen for people who are watching. There we go. Lovely. Okay, so here we are.
Yeah, so I mean, as we mentioned there, even just these kind of highlights just bring out some of what we've spoken about. I guess the first point I mentioned a little bit earlier was in that second paragraph that 86.9% are where COVID is being claimed as the underlying cause of death. So if you think about the rest of them, so that's just over 450 deaths or something. The remainder.
This is for Northern Ireland.
For Northern Ireland only, yeah, exactly. They're not even claiming for those ones that COVID was a causal factor in it. It was just coincidental. So again, it's kind of like, well, if you really know that COVID didn't cause the death, then you really shouldn't be reporting in those kind of numbers. I mean, you have an idea in medicine, and obviously beyond that, when the patient dies, of the idea of the autopsy and working out, causes of death and whether you need to investigate something or there's some sort of an issue to be addressed there. And so, when you're dealing with essentially a pandemic, when you're dealing with a public health situation, it is appropriate to go back and start figuring out what these numbers truly mean. So it is good of them to at least have put that there. But really, why are we still tracking with, all the so-called COVID deaths when we already know the ones where it was an underlying factor? I think, that's kind of an interesting thing. And then secondly, you see this idea And this holds up pretty well across the UK. This idea that only 10.3% of the COVID deaths actually had no pre-existing conditions. And remember, this is very important because most of the fear and most of the hysteria at the beginning of the pandemic around COVID is really around this idea, you're healthy, you're perfectly fine, and COVID comes and sweeps you away. And you can see there only 311 deaths between March 2020 and September 2021 in that category. I think the figure for Scotland is around 7.1%, and I think that you're going to find that's going to hold up pretty similarly across the UK. And then obviously you can see the third point as well. On average, the number of pre-existing conditions is 2.5. So that's your average sort of COVID patient. We know the average age of death is around 82, 83. So, I think some key points there, I would say, in terms of getting a sense of really what's going on in terms of, who is sadly passing away and the typical COVID patient.
Okay, so that's really interesting, man. That's that's pretty consistent that they're saying that only 10% of deaths were without any pre-existing conditions. Is that broken down by age anywhere? If I scroll down, do you know, or is that
it's not a particularly extensive document. You can have a look. I don't think it breaks down too much. I think these are amongst the only graphs actually in this particular document. There may be others. This is one I picked because it's from NISRA. It's a pretty slim pickings, really, in terms of what they give.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see some age, but again, and this is very interesting, actually.
Here it is. This is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
Perfect.
What I was going to say, you notice though, with the bucketing of the ages, they've got the 0 to 59. Now,
that's amazing.
I can tell a quick story on this, actually. This bucketing of data is exactly what Professor Fenton's been dealing with. He's a professor, I think, at one of the universities in London. I think it might be Queen Mary. And he's been looking into all-cause mortality. So he's trying to answer the question, are more people dying who are vaccinated or unvaccinated? A slightly different question. And what they did for him with the ONS data is the same thing. They gave him 0 to 59, which makes it very difficult if you're trying to understand this type of data. So you can see there again.
Is this sorry, just to clarify, is this across the whole of the UK?
I think this whole paper generally has been for Northern Ireland, but
just because that's like, why is this? Because it says figure 4 proportion of COVID deaths without pre-existing conditions, but there's 3,000, and that's the number of deaths.
Yes,
like, total.
I think,
unless that's just really badly marked, in which case NISRA sort your shit out.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I think this is well, we know from Northern Ireland that the number without a pre-existing condition is only 334 in total. So if it's more than that, then it's not just Northern Ireland. In fact, you can see down there
figure 4 without pre-existing conditions, but it doesn't say where. Come on, NISRA. See, this is the problem, right? This is like, no, but this is a serious point, man. Like, here are two people, like, honestly trying to look at what's happening and honestly trying to interpret the data. And it's like pulling teeth. And you would think that there was so much focus, especially in healthcare over the past 10 years, with like science communication and, making people understand. And we had the ability for governments to do this. And instead it's left to me and you, like governments could be going through these things and explaining what we're looking at. Chris Whitty, they could have fucking hired someone literally to do nothing but answer questions online all day and all night. That would have been a great idea, actually. But it's still a little confusing. Proportion of COVID deaths without pre-existing conditions. Figure 4. Yeah. Why does it not say where it's from? It's really irritating. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
the main point is that, like, look at this. They fucking grouped 0 to 59 in.
Yeah, absolutely. Which and just to say on this, the reason that would be important is because, it's quite likely that would skew more towards the older part of that age demographic, i.e. into the 50s, right? You would expect there to be fewer people who are sort of, teens or 20s who are dying of COVID without underlying conditions.
Yeah.
But you can't tell because, the idea there, when you look at it, you think, oh, well, it's a uniformly distributed across that massive age range, but it almost certainly will not be. It will be...
Yeah, it's 60 years and then 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 90 and over. Wow. They really know how to skew the graphs. I'm just trying to read here what I was saying. But anyway, sorry, I've distracted you from your point. You were trying to make some good, sensible piece of...
No, all good. I was just making that point around the bucketing of the data. It can't hide the fact that, even with this particular graph, there's relatively few people in that younger age range, thankfully. And remember, when COVID first came out, we didn't know in terms of whether younger people could be really, really badly affected. But thankfully, mostly young people are well protected thanks to their excellent innate immunity, which gives them a lot of protection.
Okay, I think this is just badly labelled because I've just had a read through this, and it says there were 3,000 deaths registered up to where COVID was identified as the underlying cause. So out of these 311 out of 3,007, there were no pre-existing conditions. And then, why does this say proportion of 19 deaths with pre-existing conditions by age group? It must mean with pre-existing conditions by age group. That must be the typo, because that's the only way this makes sense. But anyway, because that's the exact number, and they're saying, yeah. Anyway, so they can't even give us the fucking actual data. Thanks, guys. But anyway, so the main issue here is the classification. And the question becomes, like, how many of these people would have died already? And again, this is not trying to sound like callous.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we know that the things that we have done in response to this virus, based on the data that we have been given, wasn't horrendously damaging of a portion of magnitude far greater than what would have happened had we not done anything? And that's the question that a lot of people have been trying to answer. And like I spoke to Paul Fritschers last year, who wrote the Great COVID Panic. And he's a well-being economist, and he argued that the cost was 50 times outweighing what we were saving, which is just horrifying. So, yeah, it's a really difficult situation to be in. It's like, well, what is your sense of how this was done? Like, was it panicking? Was it, what led us to this position where every death was classified as a COVID death?
Well, I mean, from the early days, there was a lot of media attention towards COVID from, television adverts and radio broadcasts and everything, trying to constantly message around it. I mean, there are, over 200 common cold-causing viruses, right? Not just coronaviruses, rhinoviruses. You've also got influenza as well. So, look, there's a lot of things going on. Obviously, what we hear about is COVID because of... sadly, it can lead to very severe disease and death. So I think, again, when it comes to treatment, and we don't talk about this very much, even now, outpatient treatment and treatment for early intervention therapeutics receives minimal attention across the board. But actually, just because there are some, vaccines, let's just say that, some people very strongly believe in, we don't need to put all your eggs into one basket. There should be public health messaging about other things as well. And so I think there's an obsession around COVID for perhaps political reasons, and perhaps there shouldn't be. And I think it's the same thing you really seen throughout. It's just trying to constantly keep COVID relevant and make everybody think about it constantly. And going to the current times, for example, with the latest dominating variant, which is Omicron, which essentially is relatively mild for most people, but there is starting to be a little bit of a step change, which is nice, but that's essentially what I see. It's until recently anyway, it's been a very narrowly focused discussion, really. It's been, have you got COVID? Stay at home until you're hypoxic and requiring hospitalization, and take this product we're offering to you, and don't worry about early intervention treatments.
Yeah, it's been so bad because I think it was Peter McCullough on Joe Rogan, and he just said, look, imagine you're a 55, 60-year-old man and you contract COVID. You're just told, stay at home until you can't breathe. That's it. No one says, take XYZ vitamins. No one says, hey, maybe this drug could help.
Yeah.
No one says, take lots of fluids. Like, that's the barest of minimums that's expected.
Right.
Like, that's what people say. Like, when you get the flu, bed rest and fluids. It's like, I'm not saying that that's the fucking cure to COVID. What I'm saying is, our early treatment response to the fucking flu is better than our response to COVID. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why that has not been a discussion. Because I already got fucking half banned from YouTube earlier last year for discussing the wrong kind of drug as a potential in a trial. And I got banned. For a week. So,
and it's all there in the literature. I mean, what we're talking about, there's, before you get to the adaptive immune system from vaccination, which is a reasonable target to want to bolster. So I'm not knocking some of the theory behind it, even though what it's become, I don't think is what it's cracked up to be. And certainly what it was marketed as. It was marketed, remember, with the 95% efficacy that would stop infection and transmission, and that really would have put paid to COVID. Now, that hasn't happened for a number of reasons. But before you get to the adaptive immune system, you have the innate immune system. So you have the white blood cells, you have your ability to clear a viral infection. This is what children rely on very strongly, the epithelial cells in the upper airways. Before it causes symptoms, even before you even get to disease-causing manifestations of COVID, you can stamp down on that virus, and you might be able to boost that even through things as simple as exercise, good vitamins, vitamin D, zinc, NAC, many other things. Again, it's not saying, everyone who boosts the innate immune system, no one's going to get a severe case of COVID. But it is saying, well, there's a meta-analysis saying with the right levels of vitamin D3, there should be no excess mortality from COVID. That's a peer-reviewed meta-analysis I've looked at. So we know that. I know I've read papers from immunologists from Germany in May 2020 saying, no matter what, right now, zinc would be very, very helpful to the innate immune system. Again, it's known an effective mechanism for inhibiting the viral replication of coronaviruses is delivering zinc into the cells. So these are not difficult concepts, but we don't hear a lot about them. Neither do we hear much about, we talk about masks, but we don't hear about nasal sprays and mouthwashes, povidone iodine, for example, or as I heard Dr. McCullough talking about the success in Bangladesh of really good nasal and oral hygiene. Again, this is what we're really talking about, is diversifying the public health strategy. And maybe that's a sort of softer way of looking at it, rather than just, it's the vaccine or it's kind of natural health. It's sort of like, well, what about diversification and choice?
Yeah, because, it's become quite clear, actually, that the vaccines aren't stopping people getting Omicron.
Right.
And it's not stopping everyone from dying. Like, it seems to be stopping, I don't even know what the exact portion is. A portion of people from dying within a certain window of efficacy, depending on whatever variant you get, and depending on what fucking batch of the vaccine you've got, and depending on which vaccine you've got, and where the fucking stars were aligned with Mars whenever you took it. But this is what I wanted to get up, was just this thing you mentioned there, the COVID mortality risk. It's just so people, again, this is what I try to do anytime I'm having these kinds of discussions, is I pull up as much as possible in order to show, look, this is real. Take it, interpret it as you like, but the facts that we're discussing are real. So yeah, I assume this is it.
Yes,
absolutely. I will put the link for this in the description for anyone. But yeah, so here it is. Vitamin D3 status, mortality rate close to 0 could theoretically be achieved at 50. I don't even know. I'm not sure what this means. That's a dose. Let's go with that, right? I can't pretend to have that in-depth knowledge of medical stuff. But yeah, the point is that you're talking about things that are real, and the iodine that you were talking about as well was, and the nasal spray in Bangladesh is a real situation. The use of the drug that shall not be named in places like India and Uttar Pradesh and Japan now.
Yeah.
All of these things mean that it's just baffling to me that we can't have a discussion that says this thing might also help.
Right, exactly. And also, I like to put this question out there, which is, surely everyone knows there's a group of people who, for whatever reason, whether of conscience, whether of just their iron will, they just decided that it's not for them to take these new treatments, right? These new vaccines. Don't they deserve, and aren't they entitled to public health advice? Should they not know, for example, everything we've just looked at there with the vitamin D? Or what about the idea that, obesity is a risk factor? We know that SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, likes to infect human adipose tissue. In the work I've done, I've looked into, and I've seen there's a study, I think it was Kaiser Permanente from California, large study. They looked at 50,000 people, and they tried to find just statistical association, people who don't fare well with COVID. I think the endpoint was mortality. What was the highest risk factor where most of the people seem to have? And it was actually obesity was the association that they found. So again, and it makes sense, as I just mentioned, with the human adipose tissue being infected with COVID. So these are the kind of things really that everyone deserves to know, really, which is just good, solid, old-fashioned public health advice.
Yeah. I saw a fantastic meme that was someone saying you should trust the science, and they said the science says it's bad to be obese. And which was hilarious. But yeah, I got up a couple of things just to point out that you're totally right. Obesity's 9 out of 10 COVID deaths could have been avoided in countries with high obesity levels, and that was like a suspicion of mine early on. It's like when I looked at the deaths, I said, right, okay, where's getting smashed? It's like Britain, America, Italy, Brazil, France, Spain, all of these like highly developed Western nations with like high levels of obesity. And to suggest that these unhealthy fucks are the reason that loads of people died, I don't think is insane. Like, I can't pretend like I'm the healthiest person in the world, but I try. I look after myself. I like trying, go to the gym, go to the sauna, like enjoy trying to eat, not lots of crap, trying to take my vitamins, and to suggest that it's this binary, ridiculous thing, whereas like if you're vaccinated, you're safe, and if you're not, up to date with however many boosters, the government now decides you need to have, then you're unhealthy. It's so insane to me.
Yeah. But it is. It's not sophisticated. It's not very subtle. It's essentially, this is what happens when you have your politicians doing public health to this level. I mean, of course, there's a relationship between the two, but this has essentially been an experiment to see what is it like if our politicians drive from the front the public health agenda for the nation. Although, just going a step beyond that, I would argue, is it really the politicians, or is it actually the pharmaceuticals who are really in the driving seat, and our politicians seem to be lockstep with them?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, we'll save that serious banning talk for a little bit later. But so the next thing that I wanted to move on to was the PCR tests. Because all of our data about deaths, so we've discussed how maybe some of them were poorly classified, maybe some of them could have been avoided if people had been in better shape, given better early treatment. That's not even suggesting any of the antiviral drugs that have been suggested, or any of the new ones like Pfizer Mectin that's coming out. Any of those. Just like general, like making sure that you are as healthy as you could be doesn't seem like a crazy thing. But anyway, the deaths have been maybe poorly classified. But then all of that is based on the PCR test, which has, contrary to what the mainstream press will tell you, there's been a lot of debate about how this test should be used, the number of cycles it should be run for, and how accurate it is as like a mass scale, population wide diagnosis tool. So yeah, do you want to lay out some of the sort of these problems that people have with the PCR test, and we can go through them bit by bit?
Sure. So, and I would say I have a pretty balanced view on the PCR test. I recognize sort of why it's used and the rationale behind it. and I also see some of the issues. So essentially what it is you take the swab from, say, the nose or the throat, and you're looking for a little tiny example of COVID-19 RNA viral material. Now, what I won't get into is the huge debate around the sort of whether COVID's been isolated. There's a lot of people who get very deep into it. It's a very complicated topic, and I'm not really somebody who's looked into it massively. So I'm going to park that to one side. But just to mention that for the record,
this is you know who I'm addressing here. I won't even say your name, but like, a friend of mine has been very deep on this, and he hasn't sold me on it yet, but he'll be interested to know that we're actually that you think that there's a discussion about it at least.
Right, because if essentially you're a person who's adamant that because you can't see the correct isolated form of it, the purified form, you can make an argument right there that the whole thing is garbage, right? Yeah. That's one approach, that's one argument. but I think it's something that it's not the kind of way of looking at it that I particularly have chosen to, but I do know others who do. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, the thing for me is like there's, and what explains, the people ended up in hospital. Like, I had COVID. Like, I know what that feels like. It was a fucking heavy ass flu, and everyone around me got the same thing. And we see, like, you can see that the NHS and other hospital systems were at certain points overwhelmed, definitely. Like, whether that was because specifically of COVID is another question. But there was clearly like a spike in deaths and lots of people getting a disease.
Absolutely. And
so I just think this idea is rubbish.
It's an old sort of debate really around the fundamentals of virology. So like some people just are not comfortable with what we can call kind of mainstream virology, the mainstream theory of viruses and how they infect and who they infect. But kind of parking that to one side, essentially what you're doing with the PCR is you're basically swabbing for viral RNA, and you're using this enzyme, which is reverse transcriptase, which is where it gets its name from, the RT-PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. So what you're going to do is you're going to essentially convert the RNA, which is single-stranded. You're going to get the double-stranded DNA, and then comes the controversial part, which is the thermal cycles, the heating and cooling, and this is where you take your tiny little bit that you've swabbed, and essentially you're going to amplify it, running it through the cycles till you hit your maximum cycle threshold. And if at some point along that line, because you're going up from the low number of cycles up to the high number, which is more amplification, more heating and cooling, if at some point you get this, signal gets produced, it's found a match, basically, and its reference point that they're using, I think in the UK, I believe, is 3 genes. It's the spike protein, it's the nucleocapsid, and it's open reading frame ORF1A and ORF1B. Okay. So, there is a theory behind it. You're taking real material and you're doing a comparison. But even then, there are a couple of problems that I can see with that, even aside from this idea whether it's been isolated or not.
Okay. So I presume then that the issues start with the number of cycles.
Yes. Okay. Now, what I would say is this. So, first point to say, and I'm going to be quite balanced here, is, and I think I looked into, one of the sources I had was Public Health England from October 2020, where they confirm, and I think it does change sometimes, but they confirm at that time a typical RT-PCR assay will have a maximum of 40 thermal cycles. So most people know, 40 to 45 is very, very high. That means lots of amplification. That means, less reliable, let's just say. And it's quite well known that once you get to 40, you are looking at something quite unreliable. However, as I just mentioned, it's important to understand that essentially you will get a match at some point up to 40 cycles. So it may be that at an earlier point in the amplification, perhaps much earlier, you actually hit your match with those reference points from COVID-19. And so I had a quick look at some ONS data on COVID-19 infection survey they put out, big Excel documents every single week throughout COVID-19. And they include basically the actual cycle thresholds of the positive tests. So all the positive tests, where did they start getting the positive test result from? And the average of the mean weekly positive tests, if that makes sense. So basically the average of the average came out at 26.7, which isn't quite so high as 40 or even 30. So it's not considered to be a particularly high number. So that shows that your average sort of COVID-19 positive test isn't necessarily at a really, really high number. Yeah, in fact, it's not too different from that number there as well. And I think, this data, I think, is this is from the government, isn't it?
This is from Government UK. Yeah.
Public Health England data, I believe.
Yeah. So this is what they're saying. So this is the cycle. So this is number of cycles, and this is relative fluorescence. So what's this?
Yeah, I think, well, this is to do with some kind of like signal, essentially. Okay. So it's like the fluorescence is like what's emitted. It's like bright light or something.
Okay, I'm with you. So the plateau phase. So basically what they're saying is, I have no idea.
Yeah, that may well be like example, for example. That's essentially it. So what you're seeing there, I think, is you're seeing an abrupt signal, and that's what I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So it's like as you amplify, suddenly you see a signal, and it's like, well, it can't. It's as bright as it's going to be. You've hit the match at this point. It required that much amplification. So, a stronger match won't require nearly as much amplification. What's also interesting, I mentioned those 3 genes or proteins, that, spike, nucleocapsid, and open reading frame. You can actually get different combinations of them, and it will still count as a positive test. So if you hit spike, they won't count that. Spike alone doesn't count as a positive PCR. And with Omicron, it's gone anyway, because it's something called S gene failure, essentially, which means that the spikes change so much the test doesn't even recognize it. It's actually how they can detect Omicron cases versus Delta. It's to do with the mutation in spike. But I say that to say,
I was wondering how they did that.
Yeah, yeah. That's how they know so quickly without doing sequencing. So genomic sequencing is when they fully go, and they do this, I think, I don't know the exact percentage, like 2% or 5% of cases they used to do this for. They used to actually go and take that into the lab, and they do full sequencing. That's how they detect new variants, essentially. Okay. But they don't do that typically for a positive PCR test.
Okay. Right. So basically, what you've been saying here is then that 26.7 cycles was the average. Did you say?
Yeah, correct. 26.7.
So that's far below, because people said, what, after you get, what did they say, after 30 cycles, that was the number being touted by people, that after 30 cycles it becomes like a wildly unreliable test. And I assume that is what this thing was trying to show us on the screen, is that at this point here, and that is exactly 30 cycles where it hits the plateau. That seems, so that basically this is confirming, or at least trying to say that is the level at which it reaches its like maximum like level of effectiveness, essentially, in like trying to.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this is like I haven't really looked at this particular. It looks to me, that particular diagram, just being kind of instructive, essentially, for kind of typically how a test may appear.
Okay. Let's ignore that then.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a nice diagram to be fair, but essentially, I have another a very simple average that I took. So what they do in this other Excel spreadsheet that was from the ONS, so Office of National Statistics, they give you some of the percentiles. So think about the weekly data. Mm-hmm. They also record the 90th percentile. So this is essentially the cycle threshold where 90% of the PCR tests are below this threshold. Yeah. And now the average for the 90th percentiles over all the weeks is 32.9. So that means, roughly speaking, and again, it's not an exact, average, but 90% of the tests are coming in at a cycle threshold below 32.9, which again, isn't as high as kind of 40 or definitely not up to 45. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that you can't get false positives. You absolutely can. There are reasons why. The government even provides some of these reasons. Contamination. Because remember, anything can become contaminated, right? At any stage, the machine itself, the swab, your technique, the lab that you send it off to, human error in processing. But essentially, I think the issue of the cycle thresholds, from what I've seen, it is an issue, but I don't think it's not for me the primary issue with the PCR.
Okay. So that's actually really interesting. Because it's one of those things that you see the theories being touted online, but because they don't have this discussion in the open, like no one hears this information. Like if all the people who for the past 2 years just were that was their thing, they were focusing only on the PCR test. It's like 97% false positive, bro. Like the common sense. I don't know why I always do that voice for that kind of person. But anyway, it's just like, yeah, Jim bro trying to give you science. But like, if we'd heard this in public, like on the BBC, someone had come out and said, okay, see all these things about the PCR test being 97% false positive. Here's why it's not true. Here's the data, just like you've done,
And it's helpful. And I'm going to say another thing, kind of sort of in defense, if you will, of the government's position, but then I'm going to introduce the biggest problem with the PCR that I can see. So again, what we've looked at is essentially, right, it's not necessarily the case that every single test is hitting a match at a very, very high threshold. Secondly, the government, and there's some rationale for doing this. They point to days like in the summer of, say, 2020, when there was very low numbers of cases. And they say, well, look, for example here, on the 31st of May 2020, there was only an overall positivity rate of all the COVID-19 tests that returned positive of 1.6%. So they say, well, the false positive rate can't be higher than 1.6% because only 1.6% of tests that day were even coming in as a positive. And there's a
there were still doing a lot of tests.
Still doing a lot of tests, exactly. But when we think about it proportionally, it makes sense. It provides a sort of ceiling for that false positive. But then you could turn around and say, well, of those tests that were positive, how many were truly positive tests? Now I can say, here's the main, from what I can see, the main flaw with our PCR test results, and the government admit this one. It's right there. I think it's even in this particular document, and it's this. It's the fact that it's well known, and this goes back, through years I've looked into of the PCR test, that the PCR test does not distinguish between infectious RNA viral material and non-infectious. So it could be essentially, like dead, non-infectious, not going to cause a virus in the body, right? There's nothing productive about it. And it does not distinguish that. And I believe that when you look carefully at the government's own literature, you will actually see that admission, essentially. And that's pretty much a long-standing thing with the PCR test. So the only way you could really establish whether the aside from the issue of the isolation of the virus, leave that aside, the only way you could really prove it, you'd actually have to go and take that material and propagate it in the lab. And that requires essentially biosafety clearance. It would be something under really strict conditions. I think it's level 3 because you're actually you're dealing then with potentially infectious agents. So they'd have to go and do that basically in the lab, try to get the virus to replicate. But that's not a kind of simple thing that they're doing for everybody, right? When you go and do a quick PCR test, you're not getting involved in that. Now, why is that important? Because there's not definitive proof, even with a positive test at a reasonable cycle threshold level, that you have infectious virus right now. So if you're a person and that's going on holiday or doing something, that requires you to have a negative test and you test positive, you might be thinking, well, not only what cycle did it run on, was I one of the unlucky people where they amplified it really high, didn't find it, and eventually they found it at 40? Or secondly, did I have dead virus and did I overcome COVID a couple of months ago? And you do hear anecdotally cases of people, even people who cleared all the symptoms and they just keep testing positive. I know I heard of a young man, I think it was in Italy or a country in Europe, and he just couldn't get himself home because he kept testing positive, even though he had no symptoms anymore. And that would essentially be what we're talking about here. We'd be talking about the picking up of dead viral RNA, amplifying it, and it can't tell the difference between the two.
Well, lucky for that guy, he was in Italy and not Australia, or he'd still be in a fucking camp.
Right. Yeah, tough times over there right now.
Yeah. Like, the extent to which people are fine with that is fucking stunning. Like, that is not cool. And like when they fired like rubber bullets, all the peaceful protesters on that outside that government building. I can't remember what the building was. I think it was in Sydney.
Right.
Or Melbourne, one of the two. They're the only two cities in Australia, anyway. But I saw them do it, and I was like, bro, you are one step from Bloody Sunday.
Right.
But like, people need to get this in their brain. It's like, we cannot accept the police state, especially when like because you're doing a great job of defending the government. Like, I didn't expect you to come out here and trot out a bunch of like communist fucking propaganda. But like, what we're trying to understand here is like, what was the basis for what was said to be justified afterwards, and then on top of that, then what are the measures that you will go to, or what are the lengths to which you will go to prevent the spread of this thing, based on the data that we're trying to address might be faulty. And if there's even a tiny doubt of that, like, you can't consider turning the place into a police state.
Well, that's it. Coming back to the PCR, this is essentially the point. It's like, I'm not here to say, the PCR test is always wrong, provably, because it doesn't necessarily appear to be that way. But there's also not certainty in terms of the results. And as I mentioned, you can still have those contamination issues and so forth. So again, it's like, for that doubt that we must harbour always. We must always harbour some doubt, especially in cases where you're having asymptomatic people. So there isn't even sort of like a secondary thing to fall back on, like, they have every single symptom from the list. It's like, in such scenarios, is it really appropriate, especially when the person doesn't want to then enforce any kind of loss of liberty on that person, much less the kind of measures being taken in a place like Australia, and even in instances where they're not even testing positive. It's like, well, you're unvaccinated, so we're going to treat you differently. It's like, well, hold on a second. Who's done the overall risk-benefit analysis as to whether this is good for society? Because if you take the sort of Emmanuel Macron line and you want to pee off the unvaccinated and you say they're not citizens, has anyone done a risk-benefit analysis to work out whether this will lead to more harmony and unity and peace and prosperity, or less? Because it sounds to me like that's pretty much a disaster waiting to happen if you continue this kind of language.
Spoiler alert: this doesn't end well if we continue down this road.
Right.
Like, I'd love someone to bring up the example from history in which we decided to segregate society on whatever basis, and it didn't lead to fucking violence and revolution and murder on sometimes like unfathomable scales. And it's like, we're not there yet. No, we're not. Like, we have this wonderful chance to say, you know what? That's not a good idea. And we can learn and be the people who decide, no, we won't like follow that line. But hopefully we do. So so let's get to your, like, what is your big contention then with the PCR test?
Sure. It would simply be this. The PCR test is a known imperfect measure for the detection of infectious virus. Infectious, i.e. active viral infection. It's essentially there to match examples of viral material against the standard, right? And that's how we're using it. It does not prove, in and of itself, active viral infection versus previous infection, and there's still some material that's being swabbed essentially, and then amplified. So I think that's this major flaw, is it simply doesn't prove conclusively when you see that positive PCR that you have an active ongoing coronavirus infection, especially if your particular scenario belies the fact that it was a previous infection and you're over it now completely. It doesn't. It's not concrete proof, and it shouldn't be presented as such. It's a diagnostic tool that points you in the direction that that's what's going on. It's not concrete, and it shouldn't be presented as such.
Okay, so you're basically saying that you're getting, when you, so say you're symptomatic and you test and comes up positive COVID-19, that's pretty safe, that's a fair assessment of like that you're sick with COVID-19. But if you're sat there, perhaps you've got over it like a couple of weeks, or you were sick, or perhaps you even had it so mildly you didn't even notice, or that you're completely asymptomatic, and it tests positive. At that point, you think it's more likely to be dead virus, and the problem is that we're not distinguishing between these two things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the sort of exact split in terms of how many times it's picking up a dead virus. I mean, I have seen a paper from Bhattacharya a few years ago, this was 2004. He looked at hepatitis A. His study, he found even the PCR was somewhat quite good at picking up infectious versus non-infectious, but we really don't know. My point here essentially is on the certainty, because everything that's being done is really around, it's mandated. It's sort of, you're banned from this. You can't do that. You're locked out of this. You're withheld from doing that. And so with such strong political, decisions that are getting made for people's lives, the burden of proof should be very, 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 very high on those trying to stop people from doing their usual lawful, normal business. And in this particular case, it's not a 100% certain thing. It shouldn't be taken as such. It's a tool diagnostically to suggest probably, yes, you have something, but without knowing for sure. And it needs to have that caveat, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think we're arriving at a position where there's a lot more of a nuanced conversation happening about it. Like, I mean, when I saw the BBC talking about the different, like, some people died from and some people died with, I was just like, hold the phone here. Like, it's just like, did I skip through to a parallel universe where there's good journalists at the BBC? Like, no, that's harsh. There are some good journalists in the BBC, but like, it's amazing that they can suddenly like be like, oh, okay, yes, let's just move on from that thing that everyone was saying for 2 years that we didn't want to listen to, and just present it as if it's brand new information. Like, how do they get away with this?
Right, absolutely. And, it's what we want ultimately, though. I mean, what we want is essentially listening to the debate, and we want to influence the debate, and we want people to do the scientific method, which is to reevaluate, which is to weigh up, which is to consider. Science has never been settled, and it still isn't. Most of the things that I read about, whether they're happening at breakneck speed, i.e. with regards to the body and COVID-19 or the vaccines, nobody knows for certain exactly how the virus affects the body or the vaccine. It's a work in progress. You're trying to understand various studies, datas, assays, and trying to put pieces of a very complicated puzzle together. I don't know the ins and outs of every single part of the puzzle, and I can't claim to. I'm just trying to sort of put the pieces together, and that's essentially how it is with a highly complex scientific process. So when you're dealing overall with the pandemic, or whatever you want to call it, the spread of COVID-19, it requires a little bit more work than some people have been prepared to do. And I think at this point, and maybe because Omicron's less, pathogenic, it's a good chance for people to see whether the narrative that's gone before still holds up at the moment. It's sort of a good chance to kind of have the conversation once again, I think.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I'm not here to say that we know. We're like, for anyone listening who's not on board with this, because I know I have people on who listen from like all sides of the political aisle. And anyone that's not on board, like, we're not saying that we have the answer. We're not saying that COVID doesn't exist, that we shouldn't have done anything about it. Definitely not. Like, the main issue is with the lack of discussion surrounding things that are actually debated and like actually not fixed, and the fact that a lot of this is being imposed without that discussion. And that used to be how we went about things in free and open society. I have like, because it's the ability of like, so the people who've decided not to take the vaccine, it's like, you have the divine right to say no. That you have the right to say no, or you're no longer a free man or free woman or free person. But that's it. Like, like, if you have not got the ability to say no to something, you're no longer free. And the fact that we have acquiesced to things being this close to being mandated, like actually mandated in the UK, is stunning. Like I'm very happy that we haven't arrived at the place that fucking Austria and I know there's been some horror stories out of, I think it's Slovenia, where you couldn't even get petrol without your vaccine, which, unlike in Pakistan, they were trying to deny people bank accounts, mobile phone contracts based on it. It's like, this is not the way that we do things, you know? This is not it, especially when, again, like we're saying, there's debate about the data that this is being based on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not healthcare, is it?
No.
It's politics and then some. It's sort of various attempts to coerce people. And as I like to say, if somebody, hasn't taken it at this point, it's fair to say that they don't want to take it. And there's very few people at this point who haven't taken it, who, they're just too lazy to get down to the center. They're just waiting for a free day. It's like, no, they haven't taken it right now. They made their mind up. They chose not to do it, and they should be left alone. I mean, it's very, very simple. I think that explains why you see all these increasingly frenetic attempts to interfere with people's will and to disrespect them. It's not healthcare. It's not good government.
Yeah. That's I couldn't have said it better myself. It's not healthcare and it's not good government. So the final thing that we want to move on to, as if we haven't been controversial enough,
right,
is the yellow card reporting scheme.
Great.
Because I have seen this discussed online. I've seen a lot of people on Joe Rogan's show, for example, bringing up their VAERS data, and that is not obviously what we have here in the UK. We have a different thing. We have the yellow card reporting data, and the thing that made me really question what it was when I saw, and I don't know if you saw this, Naomi Long being quote unquote schooled by people. I don't know if I just don't know. When they were basically saying, look at the yellow card reporting data, and she was like saying it's not what you think it is. It's like these aren't like official reportings of adverse reactions to the vaccine or yeah. And I then was like, hang on, so what is it for? So can we start by maybe clearing that up?
Sure. Well, I mean, I was looking earlier at some products or a product in my bathroom, and even there it mentions the yellow card scheme, just a cosmetic product, because, medical products, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines as well have a system in place for the monitoring for adverse reactions. And why is this? Because no drug or pharmaceutical or vaccine is going to be 100% safe. This is a pretty basic point, but it seems like it needs to be said in the current times. Mm-hmm. Now, what you need in essentially every country is a platform for anybody, any doctor or any individual or family member to report in an adverse reaction so that there can be a proper monitoring process so that we can see the manufacturers and the medical regulator whether the product for which complaints or adverse reactions have been logged is potentially giving out a safety signal. So it's very important that it's a public system. So this is exactly what the yellow card scheme is here in the UK. There's portals available online on the government's website, and you can essentially submit a report on behalf of someone or yourself if you take one of the COVID-19 vaccines and then you have sufficient reason to believe that it caused an adverse reaction, which could be something very mild like a headache or feeling of malaise or feeling unwell, right up to any of these acute adverse reactions like myocarditis, anaphylactic thrombosis. And what happens then is this data is then publicly available. Now, what normally happens is when you have lots and lots of reports like we see in the yellow card scheme, we have well over 1 million adverse reactions and over 1,800 deaths.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah.
Right. When you have that, you normally would have concern at the level of the medical regulator and the government. Now, because that's not happening to the level where I think it should be, you've then got the people themselves taking it upon themselves to speak up, like what I'm doing with my work or as you said, the people sort of bringing it to Naomi Long's attention, because it doesn't seem like the politicians are expressing enough concern. Plenty of concern for COVID, but not so much the vaccines.
Yeah. I mean, I often think at the minute with what's the way politicians have reacted is that like no one's showing them the data, man. Like I actually believe that at this point. I mean, maybe not Robin Swan, he's dangerous, but that will be forever. Like that's Van Morrison's legacy.
Yes,
it's like forget Brown Eyed Girl, like that's his legacy. But I've totally lost my train of thought. What were we saying?
Well, on the yellow card scheme
Yes.
data, right?
Yes. The politicians aren't getting the data.
Right.
Like, look at the SAGE modeling.
Right.
Look at what SAGE were literally being told not to give the government the good scenarios. Do you know what I mean? They were giving him the worst case scenario, and the Northern Ireland executive were doing the same.
Yeah.
And it's stunning that is acceptable. Like if I was any of the politicians, right, who had made decisions that had been really harmful to the Northern Irish economy, like taxi drivers who lost fucking everything. Like I heard some horror stories about them having to, some of them having to sell furniture because they couldn't afford food.
Right.
I heard stories of just like people who would be living off of tips in a restaurant or a bar, just like barely able to live. And that doesn't even go into like the suicides and the mental health problems being caused by all this. And the politicians all did these things based on the data that they were presented, and they were told, here's what's going to happen. You need to do something. And if they weren't shown like that wasn't the almost definite scenario, because if some clinicians put a scenario in front, you go like, well, they've thought it through. And if they're giving them the worst case scenario, and then the politicians are basing their decisions on that, decisions that have been harmful, like the debate as to whether like what happened because of the lockdowns was more harmful than like what would have happened otherwise is one that I'm sure will rage forever. But they've based that on data that turns out to have been like wildly exaggerated in terms of like its accuracy, and I would be fucking pissed if I had been sold that. Like I would be furious.
Right, yeah, and this is the reality, is these are projections. This is modeling, and we've been able to verify when it comes to the sort of like the lockdown measures. People remember Neil Ferguson's models and the modeling of numbers of cases that haven't materialized, numbers of deaths that haven't materialized. What I would say from my perspective is, and that's very, very serious, lockdown measures have profound, what we can really think of as the secondary effects, because it's like you're not a direct casualty of COVID, but you may be affected by one of the measures in the whole COVID so-called public health response. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I see very much the same parallel when it comes to the experimental vaccines, where I see essentially modeling and clinical trials that have many, many issues with them, allegations about the data, and even things we know about the data that don't really stack up. And then basically you're projecting that onto your population and saying, well, because of those results from a clinical trial, we will see this effect on the population. And then it gets very, very serious because, these are new products. And so what started off as a problem in March 2020 in terms of the lockdown modeling, and we kind of know about that, has only continued until right now. And it's still going on with, let's model what happens if we give a fourth dose of the vaccine and get to combat Omicron. And it's like we still haven't really learned our lessons. I think what we've done is we've too closely correlated political moves and the political discourse and the tone coming from the government to essentially theories and things that have been modeled, and we shouldn't be putting so much weight on it. People should be much more free to make their own minds up. Yeah.
And I mean, like the politicization of it all is insane. Like, I talked about this with Otto English, but a lot of the decisions that were being made about lockdowns were nothing to do with like public health data that was being presented, and it was all to do with what the public would accept. Like Jordan Peterson has come out and said in Canada, there's like several provinces, like they're almost entirely basing their current and previous like laws and lockdowns and all these regulations on like polling, and the government were doing that as well. Like Sage were polling like to figure out what people would accept. Like that is fucking insane to me. I can't believe that public health decisions were being made based on polls.
Right, yeah, because the people maybe driving it would tend to be those who essentially are kind of like the bedrock of the government now, which are those people who feel very strongly about having very, very robust public health measures. And if you're the government, you're kind of leaning on them really for your support right now across the world, really. But it needs to be challenged, the narrative, definitely.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're hoping to do here before we get banned from YouTube. So, hopefully, if we say it enough times, they won't do it. Maybe. But anyway, so I wanted to get up this yellow card analysis just because this was very interesting to me. So
Sure.
first of all, they give the introduction. Do you want to talk us through some of this?
Sure. This is just a nice, simple website, ukfreedomproject.org. I think if you scroll down just slightly, it's got a few nice tables we can have a little look at, I think, on the front page.
What we do? Oh, this is maybe useful as well, actually, to go through.
Yes.
So this is what the yellow card reporting data can show. They can show how many doses, how many adverse reactions have been reported, how many deaths have been reported, and how each reaction and death has been classified in fine detail. So that's really good. But then it's important to note, as we have been trying to do the whole time, is like this could be coincidence. Correlation doesn't equal causation. This doesn't like show time between dose and death, time between death or reacting, demographic information. Like this is a lot of data that would be useful. But at least like we get a sketch of what's going on. It's like really low resolution understanding that we can get. Like this would be really helpful. But what we can know is really good.
Yeah, I mean, and again, one of the purposes of a public adverse reaction system is to be able to identify signals, essentially. So you can see here, for example, like the summary data, I think, and so obviously the headline figure, which looks like it's gone up a little bit, and the bottom right corner, the total number. So these are total number of deaths where someone close to the deceased person believes that the administration of the vaccine has been a causal factor in the death, or it may have been a causal factor, and that number stands at 1,932 right now, which is obviously a lot. And then just above that, and a sad number, over 1.4 million total adverse reactions. So we often hear, well, there's been a lot of doses administered.
Yeah.
So adverse reactions are rare, but obviously the overall total number of people where somebody actually took the time to fill one out is pretty high overall. Obviously, they range in severity from the not so severe to the very severe.
Yeah. So have we got how many of these require a doctor to say that was the case, or is this literally just what people say?
Yeah. So I mean, yellow card is publicly available. Doctor can fill it out, but anybody can as well. So it's open to the public, which is one of the things where it would be criticized for, but that goes with the terrain of a public adverse reaction warning system.
Yeah. I mean, well, the politicians who are saying we shouldn't listen to the public when they're doing things like this, would probably like to discount their votes.
Right. And it's worth saying as well, we've just seen earlier the COVID deaths as well. We've seen how, not all those deaths are even considered to be with COVID as the underlying cause. So, it works both ways in the sense that we need to see all the numbers, and then we need to sort of take it seriously. And look, the onus is really on when you have a new technology, you have something that's being introduced to people for the first time, which this is the adenovirus DNA of AstraZeneca, the mRNA of Pfizer and Moderna. This is all new stuff. Nobody's ever had this before here in the UK. So we do need to understand the impact. And this is one of the quickest, most important ways to try to gauge that.
Mm. Yeah, so I got up here just these. Let's scroll down a little bit. So yeah, so the fucking AstraZeneca is like really fucking doses, but they're like 1/3 of the doses accounted for 2/3 of the deaths and adverse reactions. Like holy shit.
Yeah, I think that's quite possibly, because AstraZeneca would tend to be given to older people who are either more likely perhaps to have that logged, for example, or sadly maybe to have suffered an adverse reaction. So I think there's probably a relationship there as well.
Yeah. This would load. That would be lovely. I assume that's not the actual figures that they're showing us there.
Yeah, I mean,
there has been 170,000 people died from
I think
headaches.
It's skewed out slightly, like the wrong column.
Let's review.
Yeah. So what those are would be
that'll load up at some point, so we'll leave that to load.
Yeah.
So, So, what do we know about how? Has there been any studies done on how accurate the yellow card reporting data is? Like how close to, or like how what percentage is bullshit and what percentage is unreported, basically?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I can tell you, like, traditionally, and this goes back to, and I mean, this is not so much for the yellow card, but sort of for American reporting systems. There's generally an idea of what's called an underreporting factor. So to the contrary of this overstating the case, it's actually the fact that it tends to underreport it. And even if you go and you look at the disclaimer for, I think it's VAERS, you'll even see a little article there from the US government talking about the phenomenon of underreporting. So I think there was a study done about 2009. It wasn't on deaths, it was on rashes following vaccination. And in that particular Harvard study, it found, I think it was a 1% reporting rate. Now, it's fair to say that, rashes probably are underreported more than very severe reactions like, myocarditis or death.
Yeah.
But it stands to reason that this is a pretty well-established phenomenon. In addition to that, what I have seen is some of the analysis, again, on the US side, in terms of trying to establish how credible the reports are. And I think Dr. Peter McCulloch's spoken up a little bit on that. And another researcher would be Dr. Rose, who he often works with as well. And what they found is, a majority of these reports in the VAERS system where you had the fatality, most of them, it did appear to be, when you independently assess them, like the causal factor, as in there wasn't another ready explanation for many of these deaths. So people do that a lot. They independently verify some of the case reports. And then the other thing that's fair to say is, instances that we kind of, you even go back to clinical trials and you have adverse reactions that we know were not properly reported.
Yeah.
And I know a couple of examples of that. So that's another sort of thing to bear in mind, is even back to the clinical trials, you have this idea of underreporting, essentially.
Yeah, well, we had the whistleblowers, right, from the Pfizer trial that were saying that a girl was paralyzed and they'd registered it as an upset stomach.
Yeah, abdominal pain. Yeah, that's Maddie de Garay, 12-year-old girl. Her mother, Stephanie de Garay, she gave the evidence at the hearing of Senator Ron Johnson in America, and there are others as well. I mean, a second point to that, that's the Pfizer adolescent clinical trial, but also when you look in November last year, there was a whistleblower from Ventavia who basically helped Pfizer with their clinical research during the trials, and they had a regional director called Brooke Jackson, and she submitted evidence, I think it included emails and other communication, to the British Medical Journal. They didn't publish the raw data, but she did submit the raw data, which included allegations of falsification of data and lack of close monitoring of trial participants who experienced adverse events, right down to the targeting of Ventavia staff who tried to report issues with the following of the protocols and other things. And the BMJ ran an investigation and published that. A couple of pages, I think it was, called BMJ Investigation.
Let's see if we can get that up.
Yeah, that was in the BMJ.
Stunning. That sounds insane, man. So they were going after. So she filed the data, she sent the data to the British Medical Journal.
Yeah, we don't have access to the raw examples that Brooke Jackson showed to the BMJ, but my understanding of the evidence submitted, I think there's a disclaimer in the article saying, that the BMJ themselves have seen and have verified. In other words, that the documents she provided to them was credible enough for them to run the investigation.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like hearsay, for example, because, when you have a whistleblower, the allegation can come, well, maybe the whistleblower is a disgruntled employee, right? And this would serve to refute anything like that because she presents the raw evidence to them. So a real whistleblower, as in real disclosure.
So Facebook censored this, and then there's a fact checker's response to this. So the Facebook said that there was missing context, and nothing in Thacker's article can mislead without additional context. So let's see if I can just double this, and we'll duplicate it so we can see this, and I can continue to read. So I'm just trying to, we'll get this up here, and then we'll get it on the screen for everyone to see. I can keep reading. Lovely. Okay, so researchers blow whistle on a data integrity issue in Pfizer's vaccine trial. Holy fuck, man.
Yeah. Regional director, you can see.
Yeah.
So not just...
Published the 2nd of November 2021. That was 2 fucking months ago. 3 months ago, nearly.
They can see that quote. Jackson provides the BMJ with dozens of internal company documents, photos, audio recordings, and emails. So that's what I was mentioning. It's proper sort of, it's not just what's written here. It's like, no, behind the scenes, which we don't see, they've seen it, is the real evidence.
Holy shit, man.
And look, she was fired as well for notifying the FDA. So she tried to go through the right process. So imagine this is the regional director, right? So senior person. We're talking about the clinical trial of Pfizer, trying to do the right thing. Goes to who should be impartial, i.e. the US medical regulator, FDA, is fired the same day. And obviously at that point is thinking, well, this isn't so good. And bear in mind all the stuff that they've seen in the first place, let alone her own experience.
Yeah. She repeatedly informed her superiors of poor laboratory management, patient safety concerns, and data integrity issues. She was a trained clinical trial auditor who previously held a director of operations position and came to Ventalia with more than 15 years' experience. One photo provided to the BMJ showed needles discarded in a plastic biohazard bag instead of a sharps container box. Another showed vaccine packaging materials with trial participants' identification numbers written on them left out in the open, potentially unblinding participants. Jesus, this is... So they fucked it, basically. It's the reality.
Well, between those allegations and... Look, what happened to Maddie DeGaray? Now remember, that's the adolescent clinical trial. So 12-year-old girl, life-changing adverse event, is now in a wheelchair with nasogastric tube to deliver the food. She's completely healthy girl before. Her life has completely changed. Now, think about this. There was only 1,131 12 to 15-year-olds who were being jabbed in Pfizer's trial. One of those children suffers a completely catastrophic adverse event that begins immediately following injection. So immediately following it, she starts to have a lot of pain. That within 24 hours, her heart is causing major issues. Yeah, really. Now, here's the key point. When the JCVI said about 12 to 15-year-olds, well, it's a very close risk-benefit analysis. Remember, they're receiving Pfizer in schools, the Pfizer jab. That's not accounting for the fact that there's a child who's gone down, according to the data, as just having abdominal pain. I quote this in my risk assessment and when I did my recent presentation, that everybody says, including Pfizer's website, they say positive top-line results. They say that their jab was well tolerated. Then you have the New England Journal of Medicine in the summer of last year reporting on the results, and they said that there were few serious adverse events, and none were considered by the investigators to have been vaccine-related. So again, the idea of causality. They're saying, well, it's not. But how can you explain a perfectly healthy child who is absolutely fine, immediately suffering from pain, and then going down hill very, very quickly and still suffering life-changing adverse events to this day, and there's still not been any step change in that, right? So very, very disturbing. And so, people might say, well, that's one example. Well, hold on a second.
No, but like anyone that says that can fuck off, man.
Well,
like,
change it to risk benefit.
No. That's one child. Like, I hate the way we've all become so desensitized to death. Like, death is awful. And like, in a way, it's a part of life that we have to accept. We're all gonna fucking die. I'd like it to be in, as Tyrion Lannister says, at the age of 80 in my own bed, etc., etc. But this idea that like one child's death is worth some other person's life, I get so uncomfortable with. It's just like, fuck you for deciding that you are the one to make that decision. Like, no one, you can't. It's like one life is worth another. It's like, oh, okay, so you're now the person tallying up what lives are worth. Like, yeah, right. Yeah, I am really uncomfortable because like we cannot like protect, like, as not you, but I see people dismissing the deaths of children, and whether that's from the vaccine or whether that's the few that have died of COVID. It's like, in any case, like, that's fucking tragic.
It is.
And it should not be minimized. And yeah, sorry,
well, it's true. I mean, this is very important, though, because people don't really see that you have to bear in mind when you have an adverse event affecting an otherwise healthy person, for example, like Maddie de Garay, this poor child, that's particularly serious and particularly shocking, because we're not talking about people where maybe the risk factor of a novel treatment, you're sort of thinking, right, let's take this example. Radiotherapy and chemotherapy is not nice. It is not comfortable, and it is going to cause some collateral damage to the body. Mm-hmm. But why does a person go through that? Because they have cancer, because they have maybe a terminal illness, or they're trying to stop the progression to something terminal. Again, when you think about experimental products, they may well be offered to people, and it should always be without coercion. It will be, would you like to have this? But the risk factor for both the doctor and for the family and for the patient may be a little bit more aggressive when, i.e., ambitious, willing to take a risk, when they're already in a position where they really need some help. But when you take somebody like a child who's otherwise healthy, very healthy, is actually going to fight this virus no problem, is not a vector for disease and spread, because actually their innate immune system will probably just clear this virus, and it may not affect them any more than the other 200 common cold-causing viruses do, for example. If they then suffer any kind of adverse reaction, let alone a life-changing one, that needs to be taken absolutely, extremely seriously.
Yeah, and it does. And like, this is, again, it's not to minimize like the kids who, the ones who are like immunocompromised, or that those one child in like millions that gets COVID and dies. Like, that's still fucking tragic, man. But you know what's more tragic? It's the fact that we have no outpatient treatment to give to those children who, on the balance, maybe it's not a good idea to give kids the vaccine if we don't know. Like, I always thought that was the case, that we didn't give children things that we didn't have lots of long-term data for, because we didn't know how it was going to affect them developmentally. I just thought that was a given. I had no idea that like there was people just waiting for the government to say that's fine, and they'd be like, okay, let's go. Like, that's so crazy to me, man. But the fact I can't quite process the fact that's like the way that we've all reacted to, well, not all, but many people have reacted to this. But so I want to try and go over a few more of these adverse reaction things just before we finish up here, because we've been talking for quite a while.
Sure, yeah.
So of course these things still haven't loaded. That's good. Or we can get the Excel spreadsheet up. Maybe that's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I've got some of the numbers here as well. So
Okay, well then, yeah, just do you want just read them out? I'll put the link for this in the description for people to check it out themselves. Just doesn't want to load at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, I would just point out just a couple of things from the yellow card data. And remember, this is just giving signals in terms of things that may cause us some concern. So essentially, we've got deaths, and we've also got some classification of some of the types of adverse reactions. So I would just pick out a few things from there. I mean, look, when it comes to deaths that are in the system, we see some of the top causes of death that have been named include pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot on the lungs. We see myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, blood clot in the blood vessels in the heart. And we also see cerebrovascular accident, and we see also cerebral hemorrhage and thrombosis and cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. So we see thrombosis, and we see, which is a blood clot in the blood vessels, and we also see aneurysm as well, which is a bulging of the blood vessel wall, which is sort of quite similar as well. So quite a few of the top causes I think those are all amongst the top 10 named causes of death. I mean, the top named cause there is pulmonary embolism, 150. Myocardial infarction is the second on the list, which is 95. Then the third on the list is cardiac arrest, so that's damage to the heart, that's 84. Now, for both thrombosis, blood clots, and for damage to the heart, like cardiac arrest, we have fairly plausible mechanisms of damage of the vaccine that can explain it. And I think that's really, really important. It's this idea that following the administration of the dose in the deltoid muscle, we know the whole target of this thing, the whole point of it is to create something called the spike protein. But we also know that the spike protein itself is able to bind to the inner lining of the blood vessels. It's also able to bind to platelets within the blood. So the very simple thing here is if the spike protein can get itself into the blood, yes, there is a plausible mechanism of action by which it can contribute to causally thrombotic events. And, your vascular network, right? It's like once you're in there, you're in there and you can move around. Those spikes can move around. And as far as do we have spike protein in the blood following vaccination? Well, there is the one piece of evidence I always come back to is a study in the Journal of Immunology, the Bansal study from November 2021.
Is this the autopsies?
No, this is actually transmission electron microscopy. What they did, very simple study, very, very simple. People took the Pfizer jab and they extracted the blood, the serum of donors, and they looked at it under electron microscope, and they found the spike protein in there for 4 months, right?
For 4 months? Was that on average, or
that was actually the last date they took the study. It just covered 4 months.
So it wasn't. So they didn't keep going and check it.
Well, I think they published the paper at that point or whatever. So maybe they'll do another. Okay. They'll give you some more results.
What's this? I can pull this up here.
This is called. It's got an interesting title. It's called. Well, I won't be able to name the whole title, but essentially it's Bansal, which is BANSAL, and it's called cutting edge. I think it's called novel mRNA activation. Essentially, and it talks about exosomes. It's this idea that prior to the immune response following mRNA vaccination, you're going to induce something called exosomes in the blood, which they basically try to play off as a really sort of cool and exciting feature of immunology. But other people would say, actually, this is kind of quite worrying.
Okay, is this it?
Yeah, precisely. Absolutely. That's the Bansal study, correct?
Lovely. Okay, so just because I'm really trying hard here, because I know we're discussing a lot of things that people will say are crazy, right? And I'm very keen to ensure that we.
They may have taken it off the paywall. I'm not sure if that link will open out at the top right for the Journal of Immunology, or whether it's just directs you to the paywall. But if they do let you see it, I think maybe it's behind the paywall. There's a great image inside of it.
Doesn't seem to be. Oh no.
Yes, yes, perfect. You've got the whole paper. That is actually, and this is a great image to show people. That's actually an exosome, with a spike protein being inducted on its surface, which is essentially exosomes are really for like intercellular communication, like across different cells. Okay. And what this is essentially they've just magnified it like quite a bit. Yeah. But it's quite powerful because what was a theory?
It's the bastard that's fucked us all.
Right, it's now not a theory. It's like that's it.
There's the spike protein, yeah.
Yeah, it's like this to me is probably like the most famous image right now in terms of, because let me tell you, this is blood. Like this isn't like a laboratory study where they tried a few things. Like they just took blood from donors and then looked under a microscope, and there's a spike protein. Exactly what many of us have been concerned about.
Yeah.
So it's like this is like the gold standard study. There's no way to interpret this other than spike gets in the blood.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, man. I hadn't seen that image. But right, so yeah, this I'll put this in the description for people again. But so essentially, this is just that we got off track there with me wanting to see what this looked like. But essentially, like the point we're trying to make, and that you're trying to make, I think, is that there is a number of adverse reactions that have been reported. Yeah. Self-reported, admittedly. Yeah. But that these reactions have been. This isn't like isolated here. Like it's been reported in many countries in the world. Yeah. Like the VAERS data that we have in America lines up reasonably well with the portion of yeah. So it suggests that there isn't no side effects at all, right? So we start with that, right? Yes. So there's not no side effects. So then, if there are side effects, the thing that confuses me a lot is it's like, why are we not addressing this? Because like, say it's like some little thing that you could change and tweak, and that it would be less deadly, right? Or not less deadly, but like that there would be less of these adverse reactions. We'd understand how to like prevent these adverse reactions, or treat them when they arrive, or give someone some drug to like prevent like other reactions to it. Like, because like combining medication is not an uncommon thing in the medical world. Right. Like giving someone something to deal with one part and then something else to deal with the side effects of that thing, but it's worth it because the thing that they're trying to stop in the first place is worse than the This isn't uncommon, but we need to know what the data is before you can like figure out what to do about it. You can't just like pretend it's not there, Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would say is everything that could cause us concern does cause us concern. So, it's new technology. That means the old safety data from previous vaccines simply doesn't essentially apply, right? Because we've not had mRNA vaccine. We've not had some of the excipients, which are the ingredients before. We've never had PEG, which can cause anaphylactics. We've never had cationic lipids. And that's an interesting story behind that. So this is for Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA vaccines. Cationic lipids, again, I talked earlier about treatments of cancer. Well, cationic lipids are positively charged lipids to help with the successful delivery of this genetic cargo into your cells. Remember, you've got to get those little lipid nanoparticles to be trusted by your cells, basically like a blob of fat or a lipid. And in order to help them do that, they create a positive charge in the cell. But positive charges in the cell can induce something called reactive oxygen species, which is free radicals. Now, when else in the last few years have they been trying to do this? Believe it or not, it's for cancer treatments. It's cancer therapeutics. Why? Because it starts a cascade in your cell with the positive charge inducing free radicals that leads to cellular death. So the point is, we've taken an idea from a cancer therapeutic. Well, that makes sense if you're trying to kill cells because you have cancer. You want to kill the cells rather than, using, as I mentioned before, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, or whatever. But it doesn't make as much sense when actually what you're trying to do is you're literally just trying to get lipids to be trusted by your cells. And this is what a lot of people don't know. The sheer number of, let's just call them hacks, that they had to do to get your body to successfully uptake the lipid nanoparticles into your cells, and then for them to essentially not just be captured and swept away by the endosomes as well, like cellular waste. So another thing they did...
What do you mean hacks?
Well, what I mean is...
this is totally getting banned territory now,
No,
but like, what do you mean hacks?
What I mean is things that do not happen, naturally. Let me say this. If you think about really what's going on with vaccines, right, in terms of the general theory, you're trying to give people a safe training example of a virus so that when they meet the virus in the wild from a natural infection, they can recall what they've learned. So it should be safe, because the whole point is it should be safer at the very least than what they were going to do. Otherwise, they might as well just met the virus.
Yeah.
So traditional ideas for this would include what we call live attenuated. So it's a real virus, it really will infect, but it's not so pathogenic. We attenuate it, we weaken it somehow. Or a virus that's actually been inactivated, so it's replication deficient, which is what these are. These are essentially types of, they're not going to replicate their viral proteins. They're going to come into your cells once, instruct it to create the spike protein. That's the theory anyway. And then they're going to kind of, hopefully at some point, get sort of flushed away. But in order to get to that stage, so remember, the goal is very simple. The goal is to get the RNA, which is the instruction to create the spike protein, which comes from the lab. They started with DNA, they convert to RNA, they then wrap it in a blob of fat and put some kind of other ingredients to kind of stabilize it, you could say, right? And then the idea, and they keep it nice and cold, they want to get that RNA into the cells, and your body's basically going to start the process of creating the viral protein. But not only does it have those two lipids I just mentioned, so the PEG, which is in things like hair dyes and other pharmaceuticals, and the cationic lipids, which has got some history in kind of the development of novel cancer therapeutics, even down to the RNA code. They actually did have to, it's not just the straight code for the spike protein. That's not true. They subbed out part of the code, essentially, you could say. It's called uridine, and they put in something else, right? So in the real, let's just say like the sequence, you could say, for it, if you remember, like, this is RNA, so it's a code. They subbed out uridine, they stuck in something called 1-methyl pseudouridine. The reason they did that is very simple. One reason only, because it was more efficient the way that you are going to create the protein, essentially. Okay. And they do something similar where it's a codon optimized sequence as well, which again is a similar thing. It's why we talk about it being mod RNA. It's modified RNA. Okay? It's not even like the RNA is exactly what you'd see in the virus. They've had to do a couple of tweaks to it.
Okay. Right. I mean, but that makes sense if, like, a lot of these things, you can say things that sound to me like dangerous bioexperimentation, but might just be like pretty standard practice in virology and in, creating vaccines.
Well, I mean, it could, one interpretation is, well, it will turn out to be a great success, right? And everyone will say, well, how wonderful. But this is the point, is, as you mentioned earlier, there's no long-term safety studies. So it's not like there's something we can point to and say, well, using a codon optimized sequence, which also applies to AstraZeneca, that is going to cause a problem. Like, it may just be a neat little hack. But it's very important that people understand that there was a lot of things that were done purely to actually get the technology to work. But do we have, like, long-term safety studies that independently verify that, subbing out the uridine is totally a safe thing to do? Or a safety study to say, using those positively charged ionizable cationic lipid, there's no problem with that. Like we don't have that. And there's some really real reasons, especially with booster doses, because you're compounding the safety issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, the chief scientist from Israel is now saying this. After the fourth dose, that there was nothing, and that repeated doses could be harmful to the immune system, as they sort of because then you're teaching it to become dependent on something I
Right.
think was his argument, at least in a very non-scientific way that I'm doing it. But I guess the point is that we don't know exactly what the long-term data is, and therefore we can't start mandating any of these things when we just don't know. But like, I don't know. I think it's telling that there hasn't been, like, you don't see doctors lining up to come on this show, or maybe not this show, but like other shows to come on and go, look, this is why you're wrong. Like, I don't see that enough, and part of me wonders, is like, do they not want to bother? Is it like like they don't want to be seen as like talking to anti-vaxxers, or is it like they don't know as well and they don't want to say?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it was presented to us like there was a unsolvable problem.
Yeah.
And even that is, with early intervention treatments, is highly questionable. Let's just say, we were brought into a position of weakness, and the population was offered one way out, essentially. So there's a very compelling narrative there that seems to be global as well. And I think
it's almost like the same company was selling us the answer.
Right, exactly. And people tell me this, like, I think if because it's like all the countries, because it's global, they're finding it hard maybe sometimes to agree with what I'm saying. But if it was just like, the UK or Ireland or something that was going down this path, then it would be more easy for them to maybe agree with the argument. But they're like, well, how can it be that like all the countries do the wrong thing? And it's like, well, because there are global bodies like the WHO, the World Economic Forum, and the pharmaceuticals essentially are like these big transnational companies that have contracts, as you mentioned, like just about everywhere. So that's the reason why it's happening everywhere. It's not just because, well, the virus spreads everywhere. It's like, yes, well, that's true, but there's some pretty serious global politics at play at the moment.
Yeah. I've got the one other thing that I'd like to raise was this book.
Right.
What Really Happened in Wuhan. Advanced copy, people. Haha. This, I will be interviewing Shari Markson in February or March at some point once the book is out. But she makes the case that a lot of the early on in the pandemic, that there was a lot of suppression of the lab leak theory, with certain journals like even refusing to publish anything that questioned the natural origin of COVID. And her suggestion is essentially that they're all taking Chinese money and they don't want to lose that revenue stream by insulting the Chinese government. And it shows you how it doesn't matter. Like corruption has no borders. It's you can't say, well, if it's happening all around the world, that must mean it's not corruption. It's like, no, that's not how it works at all.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I guess the way I look at it is people probably are used to thinking of their governments as not being so honest with regards to maybe foreign wars, with regards to maybe certain domestic policies. But when it comes to public health, people are a little bit less confident to sort of point the finger and think this is wrong. Even in the area of public health, we have seen scandals, and we've even seen things in the area of pandemics or epidemics and vaccines before. In 1976, there was a very small-scale swine flu outbreak. In fact, it only reached one US Army base called Fort Dix in New Jersey, and for that, 13 people were infected that were confirmed, and that was it. But they injected 20% of the population of America in 1976 with a vaccine.
What?
Not only that, there's more. Not only that, but the vaccine that they used, which was X53A, hadn't even been tested properly. They marketed a different one that they had, and then they actually ended up using X53A, and that's pretty well kind of like known. It was essentially like a scandal. and there was and for one adverse reaction only, which was Guillain-Barré, which is an adverse reaction. It's quite well known after AstraZeneca. It's neurological damage. It can be very serious, and there was a few hundred cases of that. And for that alone, they the program got stopped, I think, in December of 1976. And we see today, as I said, Guillain-Barré after AstraZeneca, and we see many other things besides that, including thrombosis and many other things, and we still haven't, even had much in the way of success in that conversation.
Yeah.
And then if you remember back to 2009, here in the UK as well, there was another swine flu scare, and there was actually quite an attempt to sort of inoculate a large percentage of the population, and quite a few healthcare workers, even in the UK, actually were inoculated with a vaccine, and I think quite a few of them got, I think it was a narcolepsy. So there was actually adverse reactions. Some people are probably still suffering those adverse reactions today. So that's just two previous examples in the last 45 years or so. So it's not like it's never happened before, this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, so they saw the threat of a pandemic and wildly overreacted.
Yep.
Okay, well, at least we'd never do that these days. But like, oh, right, okay. So I am old enough to remember when all of these adverse reactions, they're now admitted, but are, we don't know the extent to which the reporting is accurate. We have to say that for, posterity, because we don't. But we have these adverse reactions, but they exist. They've been accepted and admitted by the governments of the world and by the companies administering the vaccines. So I'm old enough to remember when people's periods being disrupted was a conspiracy theory and dangerous misinformation. I'm old enough to remember when DVTs and clots were a dangerous conspiracy theory. It shouldn't be listened to because it's misinformation. I'm old enough to remember when the vaccines were 95% effective and stopped transmission completely. I'm old enough to remember, and the list goes fucking on. And I'm old enough to remember when it was 2 doses and that was going to give you complete protection. I'm old enough to remember when the third booster was, the third dose was all you needed. And now they're talking about 4 in America, and they've tried it in Israel, and Germany have mentioned it. It's like, all these things can continue to be conspiracy theories because I'm fucking running out.
Yeah,
I haven't got many left that's not just like the New World Order, and then we should probably wrap this up before I go full Klaus Schwab. But that guy is creepy as fuck, and let's wrap this up because it's nearly 2 hours, and I'm sure people are probably, if they're listening, sick of us. But before we finish, if there's anyone that disagrees or has serious contentions with anything we've said here, please let me know. Please, I want to know where Jonathan was wrong.
Yeah, and for me too as well. My website is alltherisks.com. My email address is available there as well. So if anyone has any other thoughts, I'm all for that. I love discussing things. I believe in talking. I believe in debate, discussion. It's what we've been sorely missing. There's no conversation that I'm not particularly prepared to have. At the end of the day, right now, we already have these jabs available. My argument is, we've had well over a year now of serious marketing of these products. The airwaves are in support of them. Every broadcaster on the channels, every bit of power of the state and of soft power is essentially behind this. So someone who's asking some questions and giving some data is in a very sort of quiet position already. How it can be a threat to people, I don't know, to discuss it. And I would also ask people, if you're a person who maybe feels that you owe a lot to the vaccine, for example, just remember as well that what it was like for people who have experienced an adverse reaction, whose life has been transformed and changed, who is actually speaking for them, and who is telling their story. And I do get those messages from people who maybe have experienced something, and many of them would be, let's just say, pro-vax. They're the people who took it. Maybe
yeah.
maybe they really wanted to have it, right? And maybe so. Imagine how disappointed they feel if they did their bit as they felt was for the best, suffered an adverse reaction, and now believing that the scientific process is going to sort of spring into life. In other words, debate, discussion, think about things, do the risk-benefit analysis, and it doesn't happen. They're not got many people sort of giving them a voice. So I just ask people to bear that in mind as well if they have a different opinion.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you. YouTube, remember that the censors are never on the right side of history, and hopefully this remains online. Thanks very much, man.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you want to leave us a comment, that would be awesome. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.